Hey guys, what is up, and I welcome each and every one of you to a new League of Legends video. So it seems like there's been quite a surplus of new builds coming out on different champions, and apparently we're not stopping just yet because here we are once again talking about one for Akali. There's been a lot of talk about this build throughout the community. Voyboy himself has been bringing it out on stream here and there, but essentially what happened is that there are high elo players, maybe Diamond 1, Master, and even Challenger players on the Korean server that have been bringing out a tank Akali top lane build. It's been so successful in the higher elo of Korea that it for the most part is a pick or ban type champion at the moment. So that's obviously gonna mean something, and myself, loving to try out new builds on different champions, got right on top of this, instantly tried it out for myself, and here I am talking about it with you guys. So whether or not you've heard of it, or maybe you've seen it in a few of your games, well, get ready because chances are you are gonna be seeing it much more frequently. So as usual in these kind of videos, I'll go over the build, I'll tell you guys why it suddenly became popular, what's so good about it, how to actually play it yourself, and essentially make sure that you end this video knowing everything you need to know about this current build. But right before we go into the meat of the video, the question I want to ask you currently is, which champion do you want to see back in the meta and be successful? And if you end up enjoying the video or learning something new, please don't forget to hit that like button. But without much further ado, let's talk about the Korean tank Akali build. So instead of starting things off with the positives and the negatives of the build first, I want to actually show you what the build is. So very quickly, let's first get the runes and the masteries out of the way. For the runes, you want to run flat AD reds, armor or HP per level yellows, and then either flat MR or MR per level blues. It kind of just depends on what you're facing. And for the mastery page, you want to go 0, 12, 18 and get Grasp of the Undying. Again, don't forget this is a tank Akali build. You are going to be stacking a fair amount of HP, so Grasp of the Undying scaling off of HP will be quite useful. And following this, let's take a look at what items you're going to be building when playing tank Akali. This part is very important. So I'll be talking about two different types of item builds you can do, with the first one being the one you'll probably see more often, the pure tank Akali build. Now for the starting items, it just depends on what you're facing. Again, for the most part, you should be playing this top lane, and if you're facing a champion like Fiora, who has a lot of single target damage with her abilities and auto attacks, of course, Doran's shield is a pretty good item. If you're facing an AD champion that has abilities that they attack you with that for the most part are more or less AoE type abilities, cloth armor can work quite well as well. And finally, if you're facing an AP top laner, then you can go for the ruby crystal instead. But next, let's talk about which core items or items in general you should be building. Now, I know I have those items listed as core items, but I wouldn't necessarily call them 100% core because at the end of the day, it just depends on what you're facing. Now, if the team you're facing for the most part has a mix of damage, of course being physical and magical, chances are you will be getting those 4 items I have listed. But if you're facing in the top lane an AD champion, then for the most part you probably want to get the Sunfire first, with Balmy Cinder being your first rushed item. However, if you're facing an AP top laner, then you still want to get the Balmy Cinder, but then you want to start slowly transitioning into the Spirit Visage instead. If the laning phase happens to last much longer than usual and you already finished your first item, so for example the Sunfire cape, you can then actually transition into the Tiamat followed by the Titanic Hydra. If the laning phase is already more or less done and you need to start team fighting or grouping with your team and they have a lot of magic damage, you might want to hold off on the Titanic Hydra, get the Spirit Visage first and then get the Hydra. But on the other hand, if the enemy team has next to no magic damage, then maybe you want to just altogether skip the Spirit Visage. But on the flip side, if the enemy team has next to no AD damage, then you probably still want the Sunfire just a little later into the build, because unless they're trolling, they probably have an AD carry, and that's obviously physical damage. But then looking at the items to choose from, for the most part, I personally really like Rylai's Crystal Scepter. Thormail will work with Rylai's Crystal Scepter as well, but I only recommend getting it if they have a lot of AD damage. Zhonya's is also quite fantastic, and same with Abyssal Scepter, but only if they're AP heavy. Again, at the end of the day, it just matters on what you're facing and what the damage on the enemy team is. But this should still give you a fairly good idea on how you want to build tank Akali. But switching up the pace by just a bit, you can see here is the second build. This one was changed up to my personal preference by just a little bit, and I call it the semi-tank Akali build. This one is utilizing the Hextech Gunblade, which for the most part is a fantastic item on Akali. Now, I recommend going this build if your team already has a decent amount of tanks and maybe you can actually go a bit of more damage items instead, or if you're snowballing really hard. But other than the Hextech Gunblade, the items you get is still more or less the same as the previous build, so so again, not much has changed other than rushing that item instead. So now that you have a pretty decent idea on how the build can look like, let's talk more about it and why has it suddenly become so good and what about it makes it so good. So the biggest thing that changed with Akali that made this build actually quite viable now are the changes to her Q. Q now restores 40 energy to Akali whenever she procs the mark. Before it used to be, I believe, only 40 at rank 5. So for the most part, your Q is looked at as more of a utility type spell because you are maxing it last. The damage on it is still quite fantastic even at rank 1, and the fact that you get 40 energy now means that you don't run out of energy as fast as you normally would if you were to max E first. But speaking of E, which is the ability you will be prioritizing, it is a 1 second cooldown at rank 5. So you can imagine how much you'll be simply spamming this ability, whether it's in a team fight, when you're dueling, when you're pushing in a wave. It is a very low cooldown and you're going to be using it frequently. But on top of this, there's quite a bit of synergy with the items you're getting. For instance, the Sunfire cape you're getting while you are invisible within your W will still deal the damage to the minions or enemies around you, which is pretty cool. Again, you are getting Grasp of the Undying, which in the laning phase is very important to proc as often as possible, and your W only makes it easier. Because you can throw your Q, go into your W invisible, you can wait for the proc on the Grasp of the Undying, walk up, auto attack to proc the Q mark as well. And it's a lot of damage, it scales off of HP which you're stacking, and it works quite surprisingly well. She's a very strong split pusher again because you are getting that Titanic Hydra, so your damage on towers is quite significant still, and with Sunfire and your 1 second E ability, you are going to be clearing a full wave of minions very quickly. So overall, I mean, the reason it's good is again the changes to Q, your E being 1 second cooldown, the item synergy and mastery synergy, dealing a surprisingly good amount of damage still even though you are mainly tank, scaling off of the Titanic Hydra, and also having a decent amount of AoE damage in the teamfight with your E spam and your Bombies or Sunfire cape. However, on the negative side, well, the playstyle is going to be different than the traditional assassin style Akali, so it may get some getting used to. On top of that, it is a little sad that Akali feels like she has to resort to such an awkward-ish kind of build and not really play the way she's meant to be played. Full assassin mode. You are a little weaker before your power spike and obviously before you get your ultimate, which I'll talk about in just a bit, and you run out of energy very quickly because again you are going to be spamming your E. So even with the buff on your Q's energy, you are still going to run out of energy fairly quickly, especially in a prolonged teamfight. But following this, let's quickly talk about some general tips and tricks to keep in mind when playing tank Akali. So in the background as I'm talking about this, you're going to see 2 clips giving you a basic idea on how you can play the laning phase to abuse your W, the Grasp of the Undying, and overall how you should use the skill sets. Again, you want to use your W to help proc the Grasp of the Undying effect. Your Q is mainly considered just free damage and the energy restoration. One of the main things I've noticed when playing Akali and testing it out for myself is, once you have your ultimate and your Bombi Cinder, this is when you can really start going ham on the trades, as you're seeing currently with the Aurelia. You simply throw your Q and just go on your ultimate after you wait a little bit for your Q cooldown to be back up once again, and you for the most part just go ham. You're very tanky at this point in the game and most likely they cannot out damage you as well because again you have so many different sources of damage coming in. It is surprisingly quite strong at this point in the game, and chances are you'll be able to outduel a lot of champions in the top lane. So again, it will take a bit of practice, but the laning phase with this build is very important, so I recommend you practice quite a bit. Again, once you get a better idea on how it can work and how you can really abuse how Akali's kit works with these items, it does feel a lot easier. But again, a typical combo can be to throw your Q, wait for the CDR on the Q, then use your ultimate to go in, auto attack to proc the Q and the Grasp of the Undying, use your E, throw a Q, auto attack again, use your E, use your ult, and then rinse and repeat. Chances are a good opponent will be buying a lot of pink wards against you, but again, as you see in this part of the game, even though this Fiora has bought probably 10 pink wards, she hasn't really got much out of them because whenever she drops it down, I disengage with my ultimate. Sometimes I bait out her ultimate, maybe then run away with mine, and then I go back in after her ultimate is back on cooldown. In a teamfight, you want to be playing as a disruptor and for the most part a semi-assassin. Your damage isn't anything special, but it is still definitely quite there. Especially if you have Rylai's Crystal Scepter, you jump on the backline like the enemy ADC, go ham on them, use all your abilities, your E consistently damaging them as well, slowing them over and over and over, and you are gonna make their life a living nightmare. But another very important thing is what abilities do you max on this champion, especially with this build. So you start with Q at level 1, and if you're facing top lane a ranged champion or a champion you feel like just has more damage than you do at level 2, maybe like Renekton, get your W. However, if you feel like you can match the damage, then you want to get your E at level 2, and then level 3 get the one you didn't get at level 2. Following that, max out your E ability first, put another point into your Q, make it rank 2 at level 8, and then start maxing out your W and then finish off your Q at the very end. And for the summoners, Flash and Teleport is quite standard for top lane, but you can take Ignite, but it kind of forces you to have to win the laning phase. So I honestly highly recommend Teleport. And now we're on to the final part of the video, my final rating. So despite what you may have thought, I gave it only a 7 out of 10, which is still very respectable, but I don't really consider it a very overpowered type build. I mean, yeah, it definitely is strong, and if you're ahead or doing well, it will feel actually quite overpowered. But for the most part, it doesn't feel like you can get to that stage very frequently. It doesn't feel like it's very reliable, and that's kind of my biggest downfall. It just doesn't feel like Akali should be played this way, but unfortunately, this is probably the most effective way to play her regardless. But that is about it for this video, guys. I mean, there you have it, the Korean tank Akali top lane build that you probably have been hearing about, or you will very soon. So as usual, guys, if you ended up enjoying this video, make sure to hit that like button to show your support. Share this with your friends, it really helped me out quite a lot. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and check out my other videos as well. And here are my favorite answers from the previous video's question: what is your favorite ADC to play? But I thank you so much for watching, and I really hope to see you for the next video. Peace.